Today, we're diving into the really provocative thesis from K.M. Uriel Nawej's book, White Poison. Our goal here is pretty simple. We're just going to neutrally break down the author's core argument, which is that Christianity wasn't just a sidekick to colonialism in Africa, but was actually its main weapon.
The book kicks off with this really powerful quote from Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya's first president, and it perfectly sets the stage. The author argues this quote isn't just a clever saying. It describes a kind of spiritual trade-off that ended up having massive, devastating consequences on the ground.
So, this all leads to the central question the author is trying to answer. He looks around and sees what he calls an inferiority complex, a colonized mentality that's still around in Africa, long after the flags changed. And he asks, where did this actually come from? Was it just some historical accident?
Well, according to the book, the answer is a hard no. The author's whole point is that this psychological state wasn't just a side effect of colonialism. It was the goal, a poison, as he calls it, that was carefully mixed and intentionally injected to basically paralyze the continent.
And the author gives this whole process a name: religious assimilation. He defines it as the main strategy. The idea is kind of straightforward. If you can rip out a people's original spiritual beliefs and replace them with your own, you can control everything about them. It's presented as the master key that opens all the other doors to control.
This slide does a great job of showing the author's proposed sequence of events. Step 1, achieve religious assimilation. Once you've got that, economic exploitation becomes a whole lot easier. And, once you control their religion and their economy, political domination is pretty much the guaranteed final step. The book argues that this first step wasn't just important, it was the linchpin for the whole colonial project.
Okay, so for his primary evidence, the author points to a widely known but historically disputed speech that's attributed to King Leopold II in 1883. In this first bit, the author highlights how the mission's top priority wasn't about saving souls, it was explicitly about serving the interests of Belgium.
And the speech continues with what the author claims was the economic game plan. The idea was to use the Bible to teach that being poor was a good thing, a virtue. If you can teach people to avoid getting rich on earth so they can get into heaven, well, they're not going to fight you for the diamonds and the rubber, are they?
And this is the final piece of the speech that the book zooms in on. It deals with control of the mind and the body. The author uses this to argue that the whole education system was designed to shut down critical thinking. It was all about belief, not reason. And if that didn't work, it was all to be backed up by brute force. The author argues that this way of thinking wasn't just talk, it was actually written into law centuries before Leopold. He points to the French Black Code from 1685 as a perfect example. And look at this, the very first articles are all about forcing religious conversion. That comes right before the rules about brutal punishments and literally defining people as property.
Now, to really drive home his claim that the religion itself was a tool, the author shows us this timeline of key church doctrines. His argument is that these beliefs weren't there from the very beginning. He says they were invented by humans and added over hundreds of years. Things like the cult of Mary or papal infallibility. To him, this proves the religion was a flexible tool that could create new rules to serve its own power on earth.
Right, so here, the author gets into how this assimilation was pulled off psychologically. He pulls quotes from missionaries who literally called Africans a people without history, without philosophy. The book argues this wasn't just a random insult. It was a strategy, a campaign to completely erase African heritage, to create a kind of cultural vacuum that the colonizers' values could then rush in to fill.
And this leads us to a huge turning point in the book's argument. If African culture and religion were being systematically wiped out, what exactly was being lost? So the author asks this really important question. Did Africa have its own spiritual leaders, its own prophets who were intentionally silenced and just written out of history? The author's first example goes way, way back to ancient Egypt. He talks about Osiris, who he says was called Kem-Wr, or the Great Black in ancient texts. Nawej presents Osiris not just as some myth, but as a real indigenous African prophet whose story was either ignored or maybe even co-opted by European historians later on. Now let's jump forward to the 17th century Congo. The book introduces us to Kimpavita. She's presented as this prophetess who is teaching that the missionaries were, in her words, whitening God for their profit. By challenging the religious order of the colonizers so directly, she became a massive threat and, as the author states, was burned at the stake by Catholic missionaries in 1706.
And the third figure he talks about is Simon Kimbangu from the early 20th century.
He's shown as a prophet who got this huge following. But the most dangerous thing he taught, at least in the eyes of the colonizers, was his prophecy that they would eventually be kicked out. According to the book, this made him a direct threat to Belgian rule, and it's why he was thrown in prison for the last 30 years of his life.
The author really gets into Kimbangu's prophecies to build his case. Kimbangu supposedly predicted this sort of fake independence, where Africa's new leaders would still be working for Western interests. He said that would be followed by a period of chaos, and only after that would a true independence finally arrive. The book presents this as a powerful, homegrown story of resistance to colonial rule.
So all of this leads to the author's main conclusion. He argues that political freedom, getting your Independence Day, is basically meaningless. The real war is in the mind. Being colonized isn't about who's in the presidential palace. It's a deep, spiritual condition that sticks around as long as the colonizer's religion and culture are seen as better. And he gives a really simple, everyday example to make his point crystal clear. He compares giving your kid a European name, sometimes even the name of a colonizer, like Leopold, with choosing a real, authentic African name. For him, that first choice just keeps the cycle of mental colonization going, while his second one is an act of taking back your identity.
Wow. Okay, now we get to one of the most direct and, frankly, provocative statements in the whole book. The author absolutely does not hold back. He frames being a Christian in Africa today not as a personal choice of faith, but as a betrayal of the ancestors who were tortured and killed for resisting that very religion.
And to just underscore the sheer scale of that ancestral suffering, the author brings up UNESCO's estimate that the slave trade cost Africa 210 million lives. He argues that this entire trade was given its moral justification by the same church logic that allowed for the enslavement of non-Christians. So for him, you just can't separate the religious mission from the horrific human cost.
So, after all of this, what's the solution? The book is really clear that this is not a call for revenge or any kind of race hate. The antidote to the white poison, as he calls it, is something he terms spiritual decolonization. And what that means is a conscious decision to reject the imposed religion and to make a deliberate return to authentic, ancestral African spiritual traditions.
And so, that's where the author leaves the reader with a final challenge. After laying out this whole detailed argument, he puts a question out there for today. What does a real spiritual decolonization actually look like in the modern world? A really provocative question to end on.